The garden wall was higher than Alina Hale remembered, and her hands were shaking too hard to find a good grip. Behind her, past the hedges, the music from the ballroom still played, bright and sweet, like nothing in the world was wrong. But something was very wrong. She had seen him. Lord Callan Vance, standing near the east doors, speaking quietly to a man she did not know, and both of them looking straight at her. She did not wait to find out why. Alina pulled herself up onto the stone ledge, tearing the hem of her borrowed gown, and dropped down into the dark lane on the other side. Gravel bit into her bare foot. Somewhere behind her, one glove had slipped from her hand and fallen, but there was no time to go back for it. She ran. Inside the ballroom, Duke Alaric Ashworth was still holding 2 cups of punch, looking for a woman who was no longer there. He had danced with her only 20 minutes earlier. She had not given her name. She had asked strange questions instead, whether the garden gates were locked, whether the musicians ever stopped early, whether a person could leave through the kitchens without being seen. He had thought she was simply shy, or playing some clever game that highborn women sometimes played at masked balls. Now, walking back through the crowd with 2 full cups and no partner, he understood that she had not been playing at all. He set the cups down and asked a servant if anyone had left through the garden. The servant said a young woman had gone that way not long before, moving fast, without a cloak, and without saying goodbye to her hosts. That was not normal behavior for a guest at a duke's ball. Alaric felt something tighten in his chest, a feeling he did not have a name for yet. He walked out into the garden himself. The night air was cold and smelled of rain that had not yet fallen. Candles in glass lamps lined the path, but past the roses the light gave out completely. He walked to the low stone wall at the edge of the property and saw broken twigs on a hedge, a scuff mark in the moss, and there, caught on a thorn, a single white glove. He picked it up. It was still slightly warm. He turned it over in his hands, this small, useless, elegant thing, and felt an odd certainty settle into him, that whoever she was, she had not left this behind by accident. She had been running, and running people did not stop to be careful about small things like gloves. Alaric was not a man who chased mysteries. He managed lands, signed papers, listened to old men argue about taxes and boundaries. His life before that night had been steady and a little bit gray. But the woman with no name had looked at him during their dance with an expression he recognized from his own mirror sometimes, late at night, when he thought no one was watching him, the look of someone counting how many ways there were to leave a room. He put the glove inside his coat and went to find his host. The party's hostess, a cheerful older woman named Lady Prescott, could not tell him much. The invitation the young woman had used, she said, had been sent weeks earlier to a family called Whitfield, cousins of her husband who lived 2 counties away, and had written back to say they could not attend this year due to illness. Lady Prescott had never met any Whitfield daughter, and could not say how the invitation had ended up in a stranger's hands at all. Alaric asked if anyone else had noticed the woman leaving. A young footman, nervous under the Duke's attention, said that just before she ran, he had seen a man near the east doors ask another guest, quietly, whether they had seen a woman answering to the name Wren. Not Whitfield. Wren. The footman had thought it was odd at the time but had said nothing, because it was not his place to say anything. Alaric asked what the man who had spoken looked like. Tall, the footman said, well-dressed but not warm in the face. He had watched the dancing the way a hawk watches a field, not for pleasure but for movement. That description settled uneasily into Alaric's memory. He thanked the footman, gave him a coin for his trouble, and stood for a long moment near the garden doors, glove in his pocket, feeling the shape of a night that had turned from ordinary to strange in the space of one dance. He did not sleep that night. He sat by the fire in his study with the glove on the table in front of him, turning the mystery over the way he might have studied a difficult ledger. A woman running from a masked ball, barefoot, without a cloak. A false invitation borrowed from a family who never came. A man asking after her by a different name than the one written on the guest list. None of it added up to anything gentle. By morning, he had made a decision that surprised even himself. He would find her. Not because it was sensible, not because his estate manager would approve, but because something about the fear in her eyes when she had asked about the garden gates would not leave him alone. He began, the very next day, by sending a rider to the Whitfield family in the next county, asking whether anyone in their household had lost or misplaced an invitation recently, and whether they knew of any young woman named Wren. The answer came back within 3 days, and it was strange. The Whitfield family said they had never lost the invitation. It had simply never arrived. Someone had taken it before it ever reached their hands. Alaric began asking around the district for anyone named Wren. He found nothing. No family register, no parish record, no servant, no shopkeeper's daughter with that name in 3 counties. Whoever she was, Wren was not a name she had been born with. It was a name she had chosen, the way a person chooses a coat to hide the clothes underneath. He thought of the tall man at the east doors, watching the dancing like a hawk over a field. He thought of the glove, still sitting on his study table, and of how she had asked about the kitchens, about early exits, about locked gates. She had gone to that ball already planning to disappear from it. She had not been afraid of being caught dancing. She had been afraid of being found. Weeks passed. Alaric's search brought him nothing solid, only rumors, dead ends, and a growing, uncomfortable sense that the man who had asked after Wren was still out there too, asking the same questions, following the same threads, perhaps only a few days behind him at any given moment. Twice, in different towns, shopkeepers told him that another gentleman, tall and cold-faced, had asked the very same questions about a woman traveling under a false name. He was not the only one hunting for her. That thought kept him awake more nights than the mystery itself did. If he was searching out of something like hope, the other man was searching for a different reason entirely, and Alaric did not think it was a kind one. He kept the glove in a drawer in his study, and some evenings when the house was quiet, he took it out and looked at it, as if it might finally decide to tell him where she had gone. It never did. But each time he held it, he felt the same pull he had felt in the garden that night, a certainty that somewhere, a woman with no name and no home was still running, and that whatever she was running from, it was closer to her than she knew. He did not yet understand how right he was. Far away, in a small rented room above a bakery in a town he had never heard of, Eleanor Hale sat with her one remaining glove pressed against her chest, listening to footsteps pass beneath her window, and wondering how much longer she could keep disappearing before the world finally caught up with her. She did not know that a duke she had barely spoken to, in a ballroom she should never have entered, had already decided he would not stop looking until he found her. She did not know that his search, however well meant, was about to put both of them directly in the path of the very danger she had spent a year running from. All she knew that night was that she had lost her glove, and that somewhere behind her, in the dark, someone was still counting the places she might have gone. 3 months into his search, Alaric Ashworth learned that looking for a woman who did not want to be found was nothing like looking for anything else in the world. He had expected when he began that money and title would make the task simple. A duke could ask questions that ordinary men could not. Doors opened for him that stage shut for others. And yet every lead he followed ended the same way, in silence, in a shrug, in a shopkeeper suddenly remembering nothing at all. It was in the 4th month that he finally understood why. He had traveled to a market town 2 days' ride from his estate, chasing a rumor that a woman matching Eleanor's description had worked briefly as a seamstress there, before vanishing without collecting her final wages. The seamstress who had employed her, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Coyle, agreed to speak with him only after he had waited outside her shop for the better part of an afternoon. She called herself Wren, Margaret said, glancing past him toward the street more than once as she spoke. Quiet girl, good with a needle, Never talked about her family, never talked about anywhere she'd lived before. I liked her well enough. Then one day a man came asking after her, and she was gone before sundown, and I never saw her again." Alaric asked what the man had looked like. Margaret's face changed, just slightly, the way a person's face changes when they remember something they would rather not. "Tall," she said. "Well-dressed." Spoke soft, like he was being polite, but his eyes weren't polite at all. He said he was her cousin, looking to bring her home to family who missed her. I didn't believe him for a moment. Neither did she, apparently, since she never went back to collect 3 weeks of wages. That was the second time Alaric had heard the word cousin used to describe the tall man, and the second time it had not sounded true. He asked if Margaret knew where the girl might have gone. She said no, but that a delivery boy might know something, since he'd once mentioned seeing a young woman boarding a coach heading toward the coast, in a hurry, without luggage. Alaric found the delivery boy, a freckled boy of perhaps 14 named Peter, who confirmed the story readily enough once a coin found its way into his hand. Yes, he had seen a woman get onto the coast-bound coach in a great hurry, carrying only a small bag. No, he did not know her name. But he remembered, because it had struck him as strange, that she had asked the driver twice whether the coach made any stops before the coast, as though she wanted to know exactly how many places she might be caught along the way. Alaric thanked the boy and stood alone on the street for a long moment, turning the pieces over in his mind. A woman who asked how many stops a coach made before it reached its destination was not a woman traveling for pleasure. She was a woman calculating risk, the way a soldier calculates the distance between one safe position and the next. He booked passage on the same road the next morning. The coast town, when he reached it, was smaller than he expected, a scatter of fishing cottages and one modest inn, built along a gray stretch of shoreline where the wind never seemed to stop. He took a room at the inn and began, carefully, to ask questions, though he had learned by now to ask them gently, without using her false name too openly, since it seemed that name traveled ahead of trouble wherever it went. It was the innkeeper's wife, a warm, talkative woman named Beatrice, who gave him his first real piece of hope in weeks. "A young woman answering that description stayed here for a fortnight back in the spring," Beatrice said, wiping down the bar as she spoke. "Kept to herself, paid in coin, never asked for credit. Left rather suddenly one morning, though, packed her things before dawn and was gone before I'd even lit the kitchen fire." "Do you know why she left so suddenly?" Alaric asked. Beatrice lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the room to hear her. "There was a man here the evening before. Asked at the desk if a woman matching her description had taken a room. I told him no, because something about the way he asked made my skin crawl, if you understand me. I don't know if she heard him or saw him through the window, but she was gone by morning all the same." Alaric felt his stomach tighten. The man was still ahead of him or beside him, moving through the same towns, asking the same questions, missing her by the same narrow margins. "Did this man give a name?" he asked. Beatrice thought for a moment. "He didn't, not directly. But another traveler staying here that week mentioned overhearing him called Lord Vance by one of his companions. I remember because it struck me as an odd thing for a lord to be doing, chasing after some poor girl's trail through a fishing village." Lord Vance. Alaric turned the name over in his mind and found nothing familiar in it, no memory from society gatherings or land disputes, though that in itself troubled him. A man who could afford companions and travel across counties in pursuit of a single woman, and yet was unknown to Alaric's own circles, was either very new to his title or very careful about which circles he moved in. He asked Beatrice if she knew anything more about Vance, and she shook her head, saying only that the man had left the following afternoon, heading further along the coast road, in the same direction the young woman had gone. Alaric left the inn that same evening, though it was already growing dark, because the thought of Vance drawing closer to Alina while he sat comfortably by a fire was more than he could bear. The coast road at night was empty and cold, lit only by a thin moon that came and went behind clouds. He rowed for hours, stopping twice to ask fishermen mending nets by lantern light whether they had seen a young woman traveling alone, and receiving nothing useful in return, until finally, well past midnight, he reached a second, smaller village built around a quiet harbor. It was there, outside a shuttered chapel, that he saw a man standing very still in the shadow of the bell tower, watching a row of cottages further down the lane. Alaric slowed his horse and did not call out. Something about the man's stillness reminded him of the footman's words from months earlier, a hawk watching a field, patient and certain, waiting for the right moment to move. Even in the dark, Alaric was almost certain this was the same man who had asked after Wren on the night of the ball. He dismounted quietly and led his horse into a side lane, watching. For nearly an hour the man did not move at all except once, when he lit a small pipe and the flare of the match briefly lit his face. Sharp-jawed, pale-eyed, entirely without warmth, exactly as Margaret and the footman had described him. Then, just as the church bell struck the hour, a door opened in one of the cottages down the lane, and a woman stepped out carrying a bucket, clearly intending to fetch water from the well at the end of the street. Even at that distance, in poor light, Alaric knew her at once. It was the way she moved, quick, careful, always glancing sideways as though counting exits even in the middle of an ordinary chore. It was Alina. The man by the bell tower straightened immediately, and Alaric understood with a cold rush of certainty that Vance had found her too, and that whatever happened next would happen very fast. He did not have a plan. He had only the sudden, overwhelming need to reach her before the other man did, and so, without any further thought for his own safety, Duke Alaric Ashworth stepped out of the shadows and began walking straight toward the well, praying he was not already too late. Vance saw him first. Their eyes met across the narrow lane, and for one long moment neither man moved, each recognizing in the other something dangerous. Alaric, a rival he had not accounted for, and Vance, an obstacle he clearly had no intention of allowing to remain in his way. Alina, still unaware, bent to fill her bucket at the well, humming softly to herself, entirely unaware that the two men who had spent nearly a year searching for her, for very different reasons, were now standing less than 50 paces apart, and that the quiet fishing village around her was about to become far less peaceful than it had been in a very long time. Alina heard the footsteps before she saw either of them, and some old instinct, sharpened over a year of running, told her immediately that something was wrong. She straightened up from the well, bucket only half full, and turned toward the sound. What she saw made her blood turn cold. Lord Callan Vance was walking toward her from one direction, calm and unhurried, the way a man walks when he already believes he has won. And from the other direction, moving faster, was a man she recognized with a jolt of confusion so strong it nearly knocked the breath from her, the Duke from the ball, the man she had danced with for exactly one song before running for her life. She did not wait to understand why he was there. She dropped the bucket and ran. Behind her, she heard Vance call out, not loudly, but with the terrible confidence of a man who did not need to shout because he was certain of the outcome anyway. She heard the Duke's voice too, sharper, closer, calling her false name Wren, though there was something in the way he said it that made it sound less like an accusation and more like a plea. She turned down a narrow lane between two fishermen's cottages, her bare feet slapping against wet stone, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She knew this village only slightly, having lived there a mere 3 weeks, and she prayed the geography she remembered would be enough to save her. It was not. The lane ended at a low stone wall overlooking the harbor, and beyond it, nothing but a steep drop to the rocks and water below. She had run herself into a trap. She turned, breathing hard, and found Vance already there, blocking the only way back out, his pale eyes calm, almost pleased, as though her capture were a formality he had simply been waiting to complete. "You've led me quite a chase, Alina," he said, and hearing her real name spoken aloud after so many months of being Wren, of being no one, made something in her chest crack open with fear. "Your father's debts don't disappear just because you run from them. Neither does what you saw the night he died." "I didn't see anything," Alina said, though her voice shook as she said it. "You saw enough," Vance said. "Enough to make you run the very same night without even stopping to grieve properly. That tells me you understood exactly what you'd witnessed." Before Alina could answer, another voice cut through the narrow lane. "That's far enough." Alaric arrived at the mouth of the lane, breathing hard from the run, and though he had no weapon and no plan beyond simply placing himself between Alina and danger, his presence alone seemed to unsettle Vance more than any threat could have. "This doesn't concern you," Vance said, though his easy confidence had thinned slightly. "It concerns me a great deal," Alaric said. "I've spent a year looking for this woman, and I don't intend to stand by while you frighten her against a wall." Vance's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. How touching. The Duke plays hero for a woman he's spoken to exactly once. "Tell me, Your Grace, do you even know what she's running from, or did a lost glove simply catch your fancy?" "I know she's frightened," Alaric said. "That's enough for me." "It shouldn't be," Vance said, and something shifted in his posture, a tightening, a readiness that made Alina's stomach drop. Her father owed money to men far less patient than myself. When he died rather suddenly, in the middle of a private conversation with me about that very debt, his daughter happened to be listening at the door. She ran before I could even explain that his death was an unfortunate accident, nothing more. Unfortunately, running makes a person look guilty of believing otherwise. Alina felt the old memory rise up in her, sharp and terrible. Her father's raised voice through the study door, the sudden silence that followed, Vance emerging alone, straightening his cuffs, telling her calmly that her father had suffered a weak heart. She had not believed him then. She did not believe him now. "You killed him," she said, and her voice, though trembling, did not waver from the truth of it. "A dangerous accusation," Vance said softly, "from a woman with no proof, no family, and no name that anyone will believe. I only wanted to settle things quietly. Bring you home, clear away this unfortunate misunderstanding. But you've made that rather difficult by running the length of the country and dragging a duke into matters that don't concern him." He took a step closer, and Alina pressed herself back against the low wall, the harbor wind pulling at her skirts, the drop behind her suddenly feeling far too close. Alaric moved without thinking, placing himself directly between Vance and Alina, close enough now that he could see the flat, calculating stillness in the other man's eyes. "You won't touch her," he said. "I don't intend violence," Vance said, though the words did nothing to soften the threat underneath them. "I intend a quiet arrangement, her silence in exchange for her safety. It's a generous offer, all things considered." "Her silence about a murder," Alaric said. "That's not an arrangement, that's a threat with better manners." For the first time, something like genuine irritation crossed Vance's face. He glanced past Alaric to Alina, then back again, calculating, and Alina understood with sudden clarity that Vance had not brought help with him tonight, that he had come alone, believing the matter would be simple, and that Alaric's unexpected arrival had cost him the advantage he was used to having. "You're a fool to involve yourself in this," Vance said finally. "But if you insist on playing protector, understand this. I am not the only person who wants this matter closed. There are others with money invested in her father's debts, men who will not be nearly so patient as I have been tonight." He stepped back, straightening his coat with the same calm precision Alina remembered from the night her father died, and turned to leave the lane, pausing only once to look back at her. "This isn't finished, Alina," he said. "You can run for another year if you like. I have far more patience than you have places left to hide." He walked away into the dark, and neither Alaric nor Alina moved until the sound of his footsteps had faded completely. Only then did Alina's legs give out beneath her, and Alaric caught her before she reached the ground, lowering her gently to sit against the low stone wall, her whole body shaking with the release of fear she had been holding since the night of the ball. "You're safe," Alaric said, kneeling beside her, though even as he said it, he understood how little truth there was in the words. Vance had walked away, but he had not been defeated. He had simply retreated to gather what he needed to finish what he had started. "I'm not safe," Alina said quietly, staring out at the dark water beyond the wall. "I haven't been safe in a year. I don't think I will be until he stopped for good." Alaric looked at her, at the torn hem of her dress, the bare feet, the fear still trembling through her hands, and felt the last of his uncertainty settle into something firm and unshakable. "Then we'll stop him," he said. "Together this time, no more running alone." Alina looked up at him, and for the first time since the night she had lost her glove in his garden, she allowed herself to believe, just slightly, that she might not have to face what came next by herself. Neither of them yet knew how soon Vance would return, or how much closer the danger would come before it was finally over. Alina did not sleep that night, and she suspected Alaric hadn't either, judging by the tired lines around his eyes when he knocked on the door of the small cottage Beatrice had helped arrange for her use. "We need a plan," he said, without any greeting, setting a folded letter on the small wooden table between them. "I sent word to a magistrate friend of mine 2 counties over, a man I trust completely. If we can bring him proof of what happened to your father, Vance loses whatever power he thinks he still holds over you." "There is no proof," Alina said, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the room. "That's exactly why I ran instead of speaking up. It was his word against a servant's daughter with nothing to back her claim. He knew that. He still knows it." "Then we find proof," Alaric said simply, as though it were only a matter of looking hard enough. Alina almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You make it sound easy." "I don't think it will be easy," Alaric said, "but I don't think it's impossible either. Your father kept records, didn't he? Men who borrow money and men who lend it both tend to write things down, even when they'd rather not." Alina sat up a little straighter. She had not thought of her father's private study in months, had trained herself carefully not to think of it at all, because every memory of that room led directly back to the sound of his raised voice and the silence that followed. But Alaric was right. Her father had been careful about money, almost obsessively so, keeping ledgers of every debt, every payment, every promise made and broken. "There was a ledger," she said slowly. "He kept it locked in his desk. I don't know if it still exists. I never went back for it. I couldn't." "Where is the house now?" Alaric asked. "Still standing, as far as I know," Alina said. "My father's cousin took it over after he died, since I had no claim to inherit anything without proof of my identity, and I was too frightened to stay and argue the matter." Alaric was already reaching for his coat. "Then that's where we start." The journey to her childhood home took 4 days, and Alina spent most of it staring out the coach window, watching the countryside she had once known so well roll past in colors she barely recognized anymore, as though the year of running had changed not just her circumstances but the very way she saw the world. Twice during the journey, Alaric noticed men on the road who seemed to be paying too much attention to their coach, and twice he had the driver change routes without warning, taking longer paths through smaller towns to avoid being followed too easily. Alina watched him do this without comment, understanding now, more than she ever had before, just how seriously he had taken on her danger as his own. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him quietly, on the 3rd night, as they sat by a small fire in a roadside inn, waiting for dawn to continue their journey. Alaric considered the question longer than she expected. "I've asked myself the same thing," he admitted. "I think, at first, it was simple curiosity, A woman who ran from my ball as though her life depended on it, and it turned out that it did. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the mystery of you and became about you specifically. I couldn't leave you to face this alone, even if I wanted to, which I don't. Alina felt something warm move through her chest, unfamiliar after so long spent guarding against exactly this kind of feeling. She did not know what to say in return, so she said nothing at all, and Alaric did not push her to, seeming to understand that some things could not be rushed, even in the middle of danger. They reached her father's house on the morning of the 5th day, and Alina stood outside the gate for a long moment before she could make herself walk through it, memories rising up faster than she could push them back down. Her father's laugh from the garden, her mother's roses along the fence, now overgrown and untended, the study window where she had last seen him alive. Her father's cousin, a thin, nervous man named Edmund Hale, was startled nearly out of his wits to find Alina alive and standing on his doorstep, having assumed, along with everyone else, that she had either died or simply vanished for reasons no one cared enough to question. He agreed, after some hesitation and a good deal of persuasion from Alaric, to allow them into the old study, which had been left largely untouched since her father's death, out of some mixture of respect and unease that Edmund did not fully explain. The desk was locked, but Alina still remembered where her father had hidden the key, tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the window, and her hands shook as she retrieved it, half expecting the entire house to somehow know what she was about to uncover. Inside the desk, beneath a stack of ordinary papers, they found it her father's private ledger, filled with careful, cramped handwriting recording every debt he had ever taken, every payment he had made, and near the final pages, several entries describing threats made against him by a man identified only as CV, along with a final, unfinished entry dated the very day he died, describing a meeting he was frightened to attend, and a fear, written plainly in his own hand, that he might not survive it. Alina read the final entry twice, her vision blurring with tears she had been holding back for a year, and Alaric stood quietly beside her, giving her the space to grieve properly for the first time since it had all begun. "This is proof," he said finally, gently taking the ledger from her trembling hands. "Not everything, perhaps, but enough to force a proper investigation. Enough to make it very difficult for Vance to continue pretending your father's death was simply an accident." Alina nodded, wiping her eyes, feeling for the first time in a year that the fear she had carried might actually have a way out, a real one, instead of simply another town to run to. But even as relief settled over her, a new worry took its place. If she and Alaric had found this ledger, it meant Vance would eventually realize they had gone looking for it, and a man who had already killed once to protect his secrets was unlikely to let a single book of handwritten entries stand quietly in his way. That night, as they prepared to leave with the ledger safely secured, a servant came running from the front gate, breathless and pale, to tell them that a group of riders had just been seen approaching the house from the main road, moving with a speed that suggested they were not making a friendly visit. Alaric moved to the window and saw them immediately, a small group of mounted men, and at their head, unmistakable even in the fading light, Lord Callan Vance, riding directly toward the house with the same calm, terrible confidence he had shown in the fishing village weeks before, only this time, he had not come alone. There was no time for a careful plan. Alaric pressed the ledger into Alina's hands and pulled her toward the back of the house, away from the front gate where the riders were already dismounting. "The stable," he said quietly. "If we can reach the horses before they reach us, we still have a chance." Edmund Hale, pale and trembling in the hallway, offered no argument when Alaric told him to lock the front doors and delay the visitors however he could. Whatever loyalty Edmund felt toward his family name, it was clearly outweighed by his desire to avoid whatever violence was about to unfold in his front garden. Alina's heart pounded as they moved through the darkened kitchen, The ledger clutched tightly against her chest, every creak of the old floorboard sounding, to her frightened ears, like a shout announcing exactly where they were. They reached the stable just as they heard the first pounding on the front door, Vance's voice carrying clearly across the garden, demanding entry in tones that made no effort now to sound polite. Alaric worked quickly to saddle 2 horses, his hands steady despite the urgency, while Alina kept watch at the stable door, her whole body tense, listening for the sound of footsteps that would mean they had been discovered. "They'll search the house first," Alaric said, swinging up onto his horse and reaching down to help Alina onto hers. "That should give us a few minutes at least." They rode out through a narrow gap in the back hedge, just as shouts erupted from the direction of the house, and Alina did not need to look back to know that their absence had been discovered far sooner than they had hoped. The chase that followed felt, to Alina, like something from a nightmare she had lived through 100 times before, except that this time, for the first time in a year, she was not running alone. They rode hard through narrow country lanes, the sound of pursuing horses never quite fatting behind them, until Alaric pulled his horse sharply to the left, leading them off the main road and into a stretch of dense woodland that Alina did not recognize. "This isn't the way to town," she called out, struggling to keep pace. "It isn't meant to be," Alaric shouted back. "If we stay on open roads, they'll catch us within the hour. We need to lose them first, then find our way to the magistrate." The woods were dark and difficult, low branches catching at their clothes, the ground uneven beneath the horses' hooves, but slowly, gradually, the sounds of pursuit behind them began to fade, swallowed by the thickening trees. They finally stopped, breathless and shaking, in a small clearing beside a shallow stream, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply listening to the silence around them, straining to hear any sign that Vance's men had followed their trail into the woods. "I think we've lost them," Alaric said finally, though there was little relief in his voice. "For now." "For now" isn't very comforting," Alina said, still clutching the ledger against her chest, its weight suddenly feeling like the heaviest thing she had ever carried. "No," Alaric admitted, "it isn't, but it's what we have." They made their way through the remainder of the night in smaller, quieter paths, avoiding the main roads entirely, and by the time the sun began to rise, exhausted and filthy from the long ride, they finally reached the edge of the town where Alaric's magistrate friend, a steady, serious man named Henry Calloway, kept his office. Henry listened to their story with a grave, careful expression, examining the ledger page by page with the precision of a man who understood exactly how much weight such evidence would need to carry in order to hold against a lord's reputation. "This is a strong beginning," Henry said finally, closing the ledger with obvious care. "But strong isn't the same as sufficient, not against a man of Vance's standing. We'll need more than a dead man's private fears written in his own hand. We'll need witnesses, or a confession, or something that cannot be dismissed as the ramblings of a frightened old man." Alina felt her hope waver slightly, but Alaric, standing beside her, did not allow the moment to settle into despair. "Then we get a confession," he said simply. "How do you propose to do that?" Henry asked, raising an eyebrow. "Vance believes he has already won," Alaric said, thinking it through even as he spoke. "He believes Alina has no proof, no allies, nothing but fear to run on. If we can make him believe he still has the upper hand, perhaps he'll be careless enough to say something in front of the right witnesses." Alina's stomach turned at the idea of facing Vance again, deliberately this time, rather than simply running from him. But even as fear rose up inside her, something else rose alongside it, something she had not felt in a very long time, the beginnings of courage, or perhaps simply exhaustion with running, a decision that she would rather face the danger directly than spend another year glancing over her shoulder in every town she tried to call home. "If it means this finally ends," she said quietly, "then I'll do it." Henry, though clearly uneasy about the risk involved, agreed to help arrange a meeting, on the condition that it take place somewhere he could station witnesses close enough to hear but far enough to remain hidden, and that Alaric remain nearby the entire time, ready to intervene if matters turned dangerous. Word was sent to Vance, through channels Henry trusted, informing him that Alina was willing to discuss a quiet arrangement after all, provided the meeting took place on neutral ground, at a small inn on the edge of town, 3 days from that morning. Whether Vance would believe the offer was genuine, none of them could be entirely certain. But as the 3 days passed, slow and tense, Alina found herself preparing not just for a confrontation, but for the possibility, finally within reach, of an ending to the year of fear that had defined every choice she had made since the night her father died. She did not know, as she waited, that Vance had already begun making his own preparations, certain that whatever Alina believed she was walking into, he intended to make sure it ended entirely on his terms. The inn Henry chose sat at the edge of town, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of place where travelers pass through without ever remembering its name. Alina arrived an hour early with Alaric at her side, her hands cold despite the warm afternoon, the ledger safely hidden in Henry's keeping rather than carried into the meeting itself. "Remember," Alaric said quietly, as they settled into the small back room where the meeting would take place, "you don't need a confession that satisfies a courtroom. You only need him to say enough in front of the right ears to make Henry's investigation impossible to ignore." Alina nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Behind a thin wall in the adjoining room, Henry and 2 trusted witnesses waited silently, close enough to hear every word spoken, exactly as planned. Vance arrived precisely on time, alone, which surprised Alina slightly, though she supposed a man as careful as he was would not want witnesses of his own complicating whatever arrangement he believed he was walking into. "You've grown bold," Vance said, taking a seat across from her, his pale eyes moving briefly to Alaric before returning to Alina. "Or perhaps simply tired. Running does wear a person down eventually." "I'm tired," Alina admitted, and it was not a lie. "I want this finished. I want to know I can stop looking over my shoulder every time I hear footsteps behind me." "That's a reasonable desire," Vance said, leaning back slightly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as he apparently allowed himself to believe the meeting was proceeding exactly as he had hoped. "Silence, in exchange for safety. I offered you this once before. I'm pleased you've finally seen the sense in it." "I want to understand something first," Alina said carefully, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to know what really happened that night, not the story you gave everyone else. The truth." Vance studied her for a long moment, and Alina held her breath, uncertain whether he would take the bait or see through it entirely. "Does it matter?" he said finally. "Your father owed a debt he could not pay to men who do not forgive debts easily. I offered him a way to settle it quietly, an arrangement that would have cost him very little in the end. He refused rather loudly and threatened to expose certain business dealings of mine to men who would not have looked kindly on them. I did what was necessary to protect myself. It was regrettable, but it was not something I had planned." "You killed him," Alina said quietly. "I ended a conversation that had become dangerous to my interests," Vance said, his voice cool and precise, entirely without remorse. "Whether you call that killing or simply self-preservation depends entirely on your perspective." Behind the thin wall, Alina knew, Henry and his witnesses were hearing every word, and she felt a fierce, sharp relief rise up through her fear, knowing that Vance had finally, carelessly, said enough to make his guilt impossible to dismiss. But Vance, perhaps sensing something in her expression, or simply growing suspicious of how calmly she had asked her questions, suddenly straightened, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't the arrangement I agreed to," he said slowly. Before Alina could respond, the door to the adjoining room opened, and Henry Calloway stepped through, flanked by his two witnesses, his expression grave and certain. "Lord Vance," Henry said, "you'll come with us to answer questions regarding the death of Aline's father. Everything you've just said has been heard clearly." For one long, terrible moment, Vance's composure cracked entirely, his eyes flashing toward the door, toward the window, calculating, the way he always calculated, searching for the fastest way out of a situation that had suddenly turned against him. He lunged toward the door, but Alaric moved faster, stepping directly into his path. And though Vance was quick, he was no match for a man who had spent a year growing increasingly desperate to protect the woman standing beside him. The struggle was brief and clumsy, ending with Vance pinned firmly against the wall by Alaric and one of Henry's witnesses, his earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by a furious, cornered anger that confirmed, more than any words could have, exactly what kind of man he truly was. "You'll regret this," Vance spat, as Henry secured his hands and prepared to escort him from the inn. "Both of you. I have friends, influence, men who will not simply let this stand." "Perhaps," Henry said calmly, "but you'll answer for what you've done regardless. That much, at least, is no longer in question." As Vance was led away, still protesting, still threatening, Alina felt her legs finally give out beneath her, the enormous weight of the past year collapsing all at once now that the danger had, finally, truly been taken from her. Alaric caught her before she could fall, holding her steady, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the quiet aftermath of everything that had led them to this room. "It's over," Alaric said softly. "I don't know how to believe that yet," Alina admitted, her voice shaking. "I've been running for so long, I don't remember what it feels like to simply stop." "Then we'll learn together," Alaric said. "There's no need to run anymore, not from Vance and not, I hope, from me." Alina looked up at him, and for the first time since the night of the ball, since the night she had lost one glove climbing over a garden wall in fear for her life, she allowed herself to feel something other than dread about what the future might hold. The following months brought a slow, careful unraveling of everything Vance had built to protect himself, as Henry's investigation uncovered further evidence of debts, threats, and dealings that stretched far beyond Alina's father alone, confirming, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly what kind of man had been hunting her for the better part of a year. Alina's name, her true name, was finally restored to her, along with what remained of her father's modest estate, and slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to build a life that did not require constant watchfulness, constant readiness to run at the first sign of danger. Nearly a year after the night she had first fled across Alaric's garden wall, Alina found herself once again standing at the edge of a ballroom, this time wearing both her gloves, her real name spoken openly for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Alaric found her near the garden doors, exactly where they had first spoken, and offered his hand for a dance, the same gentle invitation he had offered her all those months before, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "No questions this time about locked gates or early exits?" he asked, smiling as they moved together across the floor. "No," Alina said, smiling back at him, truly and completely, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "This time, I don't need to know where the exits are. I have no plans to use them." Outside, the garden where she had once lost a single white glove in fear for her life sat quiet and peaceful beneath the evening stars. And inside, surrounded by warm light and gentle music, Alina Hale finally, fully, stopped running.